Hello, my name is Lindsay Joy Mason, and I'm going to present to you a case analysis presentation for my class INTR 331. This was a live observation that I completed in the medical mental health setting. It was an AA meeting, and the rationale or the reason why I chose this observation was because of the extensive interview that I had following the observation with the interpreter. A summary of the observation. This was my third observation that I completed for this class, and again, it was in the medical health setting. It was an online, through Zoom, call-on open AA meeting in Minnesota. And a call-on meeting means, and I'll discuss it in a little bit as well, is that the person will be called on to speak. It's not just an open share. However, it is an open meeting, which means anyone that's interested in becoming sober can come to that meeting. After the observation, I met with the interpreter for an additional hour. He did not have a team, and the interpreter has been interpreting in educational and community settings for over 20 years. He currently interprets for a university and other AA meetings in 3 different states. The meeting was conducted over Zoom, but it is typically an in-person meeting. It had 70 people, participants in the meeting, male, female, and of various ages. The participants, their videos were encouraged to be on. They were not required. I know 70 is kind of a lot of people for a Zoom meeting in my experience, but also in my own experience, my personal life with AA meetings, I know how important that face-to-face interaction is, especially due to COVID. They have to be online currently instead of in person, and that human interaction and emotion that you get through somebody through their facial expressions is really important. So most people were on video. The interpreter set up at home where he was interpreting remotely had 2 monitors, one for the person that was sharing, that was on the speaker view, whoever was talking that moment, and then one for the deaf consumers. Everybody was on mute during the meeting, except for when the chairperson would call on them when it was their turn to share. The interpreter was 50. He's white male. There are 5 white deaf consumers, 3 male, 2 female, and 1 deaf blind man. The meeting was an hour long and consisted of an opening prayer, the 12 and 12 traditions, 12 steps and 12 traditions, and it was an open call-on meeting, like I mentioned. And the interpreter interpreted everything in the meeting except for the fellowship conversations before and after the meeting, which I will discuss in a little bit. My first DCCRD, demand control schema analysis, and I'm just going to briefly go through this because I have included the link of my observation that has this discussed in more detail. But today I do want to focus on the lessons learned and the reflection that I had since the observation. So this was a big demand, and it's a little bit confusing, so I'll try to explain it well. So the 7th tradition is where they post this information so people can donate money to the A program. And because right now things are remote, it's been a lot harder for AA meetings to collect money, and that's just for things to pay for like books and AA big books, the rent for their church. I know my church still requires rent even though we're not able to use it right now because of COVID. Interpreting services, paying for that, things like that. So I just wanted to stress that the 7th tradition is very salient and very important because the money has just gone down, the collections, because of things being remote, and it's a little bit harder, whereas in an in-person meeting, they would pass the basket around. So while the 7th tradition was being read, the Venmo PayPal information for that specific meeting shown on the shared screen as text. The interpreter, what he did, he recorded a pre-recorded video of the 7 traditions and had them labeled texts while he interpreted them. So this was a pre-recorded video. Then when the person in the meeting that was reading the 7 traditions at the end of the meeting, he would play his video, share his screen with the entire meeting. And so the listed text of the traditions would be there, him interpreting the traditions, as well as the salient information of the Venmo specific link and letters, numbers that they have, and PayPal information. So anybody has access to that information. Some concurrent demands, like I said, that money goes to paying for a lot of things for service entities, for the meetings, and for intergroups, and just AA as a whole. Text, for anybody seeing text, I think is a lot more beneficial than trying to hear that, especially with the specific order and numbers of the Venmo or PayPal. So he did mention that the deaf-blind man would actually leave as soon as the screen was shown, because previously the chairperson would share their screen, and when they're in the share mode, then the deaf person or deaf-blind person could not pin the interpreter. So that was just not useful for them to have without the interpretation. So that is why the interpreter made that pre-recorded video and shared his screen instead. The other collections that can go towards, usually AA has a gratitude banquet or other AA fundraisers through the year that help support AA financially, and those aren't happening due to COVID. And like I said, contributions and donations have plummeted in the last 6 months in AA nationally and even throughout the world, is what I've heard in my own experience. I believe this was a very effective control choice. I will mention this as my lessons learned, because even though, and he did mention this wasn't an exact role or responsibility of an interpreter, he took the time and is more involved than someone that would just come interpret and then leave, and not have that connection with the deaf consumers or the other participants. And like I said, he's been interpreting AA for 20 years, so he was happy to put in the extra work to make that possible, to make everything accessible for everybody. Positive, negative, I'm just going to briefly go through this. The deaf man had access to the 7th tradition because he could see that he does have a big enough screen where he is able to see the interpretation and the text that is written. The negative is that the interpretation isn't in real time, but I didn't mention that all the other readings, the 12 steps, 12 traditions, Serenity Prayer, all of those are interpreted real time. This is the only one that was not interpreted real time, again, because of that Venmo, PayPal information being printed while they're receiving the 7 tradition steps. So I'm not going to go over the alternate controls that we did discuss, because I believe that his control choice was the most effective in this situation. Another demand, really quickly, is the participants were casually talking before the meeting. And I was kind of going back and forth, so I did ask the interpreter why this happened, because I noticed that he didn't interpret the conversations. And some concurrent demands that the turn-taking management, it was with significant overlap talking, was happening. So when you sign on to an AA meeting early, everyone can just be off voice, or for the specific meeting, off of mute, and everyone can just talk in fellowship, they call it, which is like the connection and conversations that they have between the participants in the meeting, all participants. And so if you can imagine everyone just talking and not being called on, and just everyone's off of mute, and it gets kind of hectic. So that was one of the concurrent demands. And another one is that the deaf consumers really like to take this time too to see each other and fellowship with each other and talk to each other. And as well as the interpreter has a very close relationship with many of the participants and the chair people of the meeting, and especially the deaf consumers and deaf-blind consumer. The deaf consumers also utilize the chat box during remote meetings, and so they can talk with the hearing participants if they need. And because there's so many hearing consumers also, the interpreter is there and would be happy to interpret if they had asked him. But like I said, there's many different deaf consumers there, so he wouldn't be able to voice for each one of them if they were each talking, and so that's why he made this control choice. And another thing I did want to bring up, that in-person meetings, I'll talk about it a little bit, but they're a lot different where deaf people can actually communicate with the hearing community through whiteboards that they have purchased for those meetings. Because again, there's only one interpreter and so many deaf people, that the interpreter is there and he's communicating and fellowshipping with everybody, but he's there if he needs to interpret for somebody. But they also have that way of using communication through the whiteboards, especially since some, information might be sensitive and they're talking just to their sponsor. Their sponsor doesn't know fluent sign language, so just a lot of different things that depends on that. So this positive is that everyone receives an opportunity to fellowship with one another. And like I said, everyone connects with everyone at this time, and the interpreter is always there to facilitate communication if needed. And a negative consequence, it isn't facilitating all communication happening in that moment, like we talked about. And again, I wouldn't necessarily think that this was ineffective by any means at first. Before I had met with him, I was just really wondering why he chose that. And then, of course, just seeing that would be really hard to interpret that. And I think I put that, if there was something that was really pertinent information, like I think they said that someone was having a baby. So that, of course, then the interpreter would make sure that information was relayed to the consumer. So if there was, he called it noteworthy information, then he would make sure that was communicated. One more quick demand constellation. A hearing participant is called on, and the control was he used a sign name for that one hearing participant only. Concurrent demands, he has a close rapport relationship with the deaf community, the person that has the sign name. He is also a sponsor for many of the deaf participants, and his sign name was previously set up and familiar to everybody. And that man does know some sign language as well. Some really quick additional demands that I learned a lot from also that I wanted to include. The term detasseling was used, and I'm from Iowa and actually detasseled myself in the fields. It's where you pull portion of the corn out. It's called the tassel, and that way the corn can continue to grow. So you're in the cornfields detasseling, and a lot of people don't know what that means, and so I was just curious if he had known that, or if he had experience with it, or how he knew that, or was it just a Midwest terminology kind of thing. And that's why he does know it because of living in the Midwest, but he also showed it very visually instead of just finger spelling it, which I thought was really great. Hazelton is a recovery center in Minneapolis, I believe, Minnesota, somewhere in Minnesota, and he used the sign name HH, so I just wanted to make that clear that was the sign set up for that. He uses high reiteration throughout his interpretations. This is one lesson that I learned that I'll talk about a little bit more, but when he's talking about drinking, since that's a big topic in AA meetings, and I noticed he used this classifier to show drinking. And he told me this is more like a first drink, like taking that first drink. And then over time, it's like this, and then it turns into wise and drinking, and then lots of drinking and deep into their addiction of alcoholism. Another one that was amazing that I noticed was in the work. This woman was there for her first time, and the interpreter showed the vocal affect or personality and emotional affect through her body postures, emotions, tone of her voice, everything. And it was just really great to see the difference between, someone that's been they call old timer that has a lot of time, a lot of sobriety, versus someone coming in for their first day. And he did a great job showing the differences in that. When I asked him about this, he just really stressed that every person looks, talks, and sounds different. And you really have to hear their voice and know who they are and how to portray them. And you hear the person, not just the words. And that's all that emotion coming out. And he has a lot of experience with that because of his 20 years experience in AA, interpreting AA. Emotional parallelistic demands that I asked him, because I know some situations may get emotional and people may cry, and I just wanted to know if he had any parallelistic demands um, or the control choices he uses to employ for that. And he said the emotion just comes through his emotion and not him personally. It doesn't affect him personally. It just comes through his interpretation and then out. So he doesn't hold them inside. And if someone's crying, I asked him if does he have to cry every time? And he said no, like if he cries naturally, then that's just the interpretation coming out naturally and through him. Or he'll say, can't talk, they're crying, or show his shaky voice if he's voicing for a deaf consumer. Like I said, I interviewed with the interpreter the last hour or the next hour after the AA meeting, and I discussed most of these with my observation and this presentation, but a couple of them that I didn't touch on, I wanted to. I asked him if he ever utilized it as a team interpreter for AA meetings, and he said typically no. If the meeting was very large, he would, and he has in the past, but typically no. And do more people attend the meeting on Zoom or when it was in person? And in person, there's a lot more people. He said that attended. However, Zoom has some very positive aspects as well, because they have the chat feature. They have, people can listen to it on their way to work if it's an early morning. Like there's so many more flexibility of getting on through Zoom. So that's important to note as well. And I'll talk about this number 7 and my lessons learned. Okay, so the DC application lessons learned, like I had mentioned before, just I learned so much from the technology view of being on Zoom. I've been on Zoom a long time, but there's so many things I'm still learning. And the fact that he used that pre-recorded video because of how important it is to have those texts listed of the 7 traditions while the interpretation was happening, while the text was printed of the PayPal and Venmo information, and just the process they went through for that. I talked about it in my observation, but not in here yet, that the deaf blind man would, sign off and not be a part of that because he couldn't see the interpretation. And so, they actually went to Intergroup, which is like the main office, to talk to them and explore different options. And this is what they came up with. So it was a long process to come to that decision. And it's just something I learned, that when you are devoted to something and you really are passionate about it, extra work does come along, and that's okay. And because not only does it provide a better communication for and access to the deaf and hard of hearing consumers or deafblind consumer, it makes the interpretation run smoother and clearer and just better overall. So in a lot of the other DC applications that I talked about and being effective through these past few slides as well. Translation decisions, I talked about the drink progression over this and then this. I thought was very interesting, and I was glad to have the opportunity to talk to him about it because, just drink alcohol, there's just different ways to show it. And it was great to see the progression of that, especially since it's such a salient information in these type of settings. Okay, the dry terminology I wanted to bring up. That was one of my questions because, so the term dry can mean different things. Obviously, dry, if something's dry. But in AA, if someone is dry, a lot of people outside of AA may think, and that's what I did, also thought that that means you're not drinking, so that's good, like you're dry. But in AA, once you're in the program, you get to understand that it actually means that you are in the program, not drinking, but you're not working the program, which means you are you don't have a sponsor, you're not working the 12 steps, you're not going to meetings, you're not diving into the program, which gives you the emotional sobriety as well and the tools to how to live life. And if you just stop drinking and don't do that, it's not going to be successful for most people. I can't say that. But anyway, that's the dry terminology. And I noticed that he just signed dry. And I was just saying, is everyone familiar with that? Because just knowing my personal experience with it. And he said, yes, absolutely. Like if there was everyone was, experience in that meeting, all the deaf and hard of hearing and definitely blind man has been to that meeting, is very familiar with the term dry, so that simple sign could just be used. However, he said if there was a new consumer, deaf or hard of hearing or deaf blind consumer, he would of course expand on that and explain what it means. Some ethical decisions. Just at the beginning, I noticed when he wasn't interpreting, I was just thinking ethical reasons why he would or wouldn't, before we met. And, because it's communication being exchanged, and not interpreting that is not something that interpreting is something that interpreters need to do. So having the other concurrent demands and the reasons made it effective, I believe. And then the personal relationships, I also noted for ethical decisions and lessons learned that I've learned, because I think AA setting is a little bit different just because it's such a more personal and emotional level, but just making sure to keep the personal relationships outside of the meetings or like the fellowship time separate from the professional work. And that is something I did want to touch on when the deaf blind man was voicing his concerns about not seeing the seventh tradition and the PayPal and Venmo information, and he would just log off. The interpreter worked with him, and encouraged him to go talk to the central office and the intergroup. And he didn't tell him, he didn't like straight out tell him. He was just saying, hey, I'm here to facilitate communication. But on a personal level, he can't say like, you need to go do this, because that's overstepping his boundaries. So without encouraging and straight out saying that, he did just say, I'm here to interpret. I'm happy to go to meetings with you, those main intergroup central office meetings, and voice your concerns. And so that was just a little bit of a sticky situation. But being in his position and being a part of that meeting for so long, I do still believe that was effective. And just the fact that he does socialize with the deaf individuals before the meeting, I think that's important to foster rapport and relationships, and to gain that trust and comfortability with them communicating with each other, especially since this is sobriety is such a changing thing, and it's important to have those trust and comfortability levels. And then the sign names, I put under human relations as well. Just we talked about maybe how they could sign more sign names to have more connections with the hearing community, and just fostering those relationships as well. I talked about the patterns, especially with emotion and affect showing. Like I talked about, he really became that person. And he said that in in-person meetings, it's a huge crowd and a podium, and then the interpreter standing next to the podium, and the speaker would be behind the podium, and then the interpreter next to them. So, and then the deaf people would be in the front row. So they had a clear vision to him, and he would really become that person. Like I said, not just their words, but that person and that emotion, and which is huge in the setting, I believe. And like I said, someone that's really confident in carrying the message and saying all these great things, that has a lot of time, like that needs to be shown through the affect, and then compared to a newcomer or someone that was really nervous. And he just showed those comparisons perfectly from person to person. So that was a very effective pattern that I noticed. And I also said that he does do a lot of liberal control choices, because of the relationships that he has had with them. I think that he has had the experience in there that he can make those choices. And I didn't say he may not experiment too much because he's very familiar but with it. But at the same time, he when we met, he's like, I want you to challenge me and look for things that I could improve on or change. And so I do also think that he has a good balance of experimenting with new things and using old things that have been working well, but also is completely open to new things and trying things different ways. All right, well, that concludes my presentation. So thank you very much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.